start with Adam and Eve, but I do start with Plato and Aristotle. When it comes to theories of form, these two are still the two large paradigms on the background of which we discuss these issues. Well, of course, Platonic forms, they are these, well, eternal, unchanging, necessary beings, untouchable by contingent earthly affairs and irrecognizables rather for gods, not so much for humans, which does make it, well, not a very attractive background theory for well, a philosophy of science, for example. Well, Aristotelian forms, in contrast, well, still preserve the sense of necessity when it comes to the interrelations between them, but, well, they are thought to be intrinsic to the instances, empirically accessible monadic properties of natural beings, which sounds much more attractive for a philosophy of science. Now, on the background of this, I will now ask, are there essential forms in the social domain? Well, I will first argue that the standard arguments for the existence of essential forms also apply to the social domain. I will discuss first candidate for social forms, namely social kinds. I will then discuss and hopefully answer some objections against there being social forms. I will then discuss how social forms are able to explain, and then I bring into the discussion another candidate for social forms, namely social identities, and I conclude by asking the question, is it dangerous or even morally objectionable to posit essential forms in the social domain? Now, what are the standard arguments for essential forms? Well, I take it that there are certain practices of human beings which call for essential forms as, well, something like irrational to make sense of them. The first is, well, we distinguish things in the world. We distinguish humans from non-humans. And of course, we also distinguish banks from non-banks. Yeah, we have these essential predicates, we have classification, and well, we also distinguish diachronically between, well, predicates that can be lost. Humans die at a certain time and then, well, they are no longer humans. Maybe they are not even they then. While there are other predicates that, well, can be gained and can be lost without losing this sense of identity. We distinguish essential from accidental predication. We distinguish, well, rigid from non-rigid predication. There are some predicates that are had all over the time a thing exists, and there are others that can be lost and be gained. So coming to be and passing away, we distinguish these from other kinds of changes in the world. And again, this calls for something like essential forms. And finally, well, we are essentialists. We psychologically, cognitively speaking, we are born or we develop in an very early stage of our cognitive career as beings that use essential explanations. Well, cognitive science tells us that this is the case, and it seems to be an anthropological feature of our existence. It is important that this kind of essentialist explanation is not a mere statistical explanation, which can be seen by the contrast of these two examples here on the slide. Well, why is this four-legged? Well, it is a dog. And why is that black? Because it is a tire. So these would be two explanations that could be explained statistically. Well, most, well, not really, because they're much more four-legged beings than there are dogs. But most dogs, of course, are four-legged. And most tires, not all of them, but most of them, well, are black. But the dog explanation, is much more often accepted as a good explanation in experiments by cognitive scientists than the tire explanation. Well, both would be valid statistically, but the dog explanation has the extra appeal of being an essential explanation and is thus more often accepted. Well, there are certain standard models for explaining this essentialist explanations. Formal causation in Aristotle would be one model for essentialist explanations. Yeah, we have here well, certain features that characterize kinds and species falling under that kind and inherit this feature. And well, Aristotle tells us, well, we can have nice explanations in syllogistic form. Well, all C are B, all B have attribute A, so all C have attribute A. And another more recent model for essential explanations is Jonathan Lowe's ontological square, his for category ontology, where he also have as substantial kinds characterized by generic attributes. And if we ask why a certain particular substance, flipper, has a blowhole, what is the explanation for flippers having a blowhole? Then we can point to the substantial kind that is instantiated by flipper and point out that that kind is characterized by a certain generic attribute. Now, can these models be transferred to the social domain? I think very much so. Well, for that, of course, we need social kinds, and then social kind would be our first candidate for being a form in the social domain. Well, what is a social kind? In my book on social ontology, I suggest a generic schema for definitions for, well, social zone. So an entity X is a social F if and only if X is an F whose existence implies the existence of a social act. So social kinds would be kinds whose existence imply the existence of a social act. That is, two or more participants who, well, intentionally relate in their thinking and actions to the thinking and actions of the others in respect to this very action. And well, in the social kind case, this could be, well, establishing either the social kind or establishing acts of establishment of, well, instances of the social kind. And well, if we combine these two aspects, Muhammad Ali Khalidi has pointed out we can distinguish between different kinds of social kinds. Yeah, social kinds where, well, the kinds require such intentional attitudes, and where the instances and the kind require these attitudes, and where neither does. But of course, well, one may ask, why don't we have a fourth kind of social kinds? Well, let's say type 4 kinds, like, well, leader or plural subject. In order to have an instance of a plural subject, Margaret Gilbert tells us we need intentional actions, joint commitments, but of course the kind of plural subject has been, well, unthought of before Margaret Gilbert suggested her analysis of the social world. So there was no need to have attitudes towards plural subjects as such in order for there be the social kind plural subject. So we have, in fact, I suggest 4 kinds of social kinds. Well, before going into the issue how social kinds can explain, I want to discuss some objections to the existence of essential forms in the social domain. That is also objections to, well, social kinds being explanatory at all. So how can it be that there are social forms that explain? The objections, well, in an aggregated, standardized form is something like that. Well, social kinds are conventional and mind-dependent, and hence arbitrary, historically contingent, and mere constructs and figments, and can thus not support induction or feature in laws. Hence, there cannot be essential forms in the social domain. Now, what do we make of that? I will focus now on 3 aspects: on the conventionality, on the mind dependence, and the historicity that, well, are important in the social domain without doubt. Well, Muhammad Ali Khalidi answered the conventionality objection by pointing out that, well, most of the kinds of social kinds that he distinguished do feature these conventional features, but, well, that these conventional features are no hindrance of having explanatory power, but they, well, explain the conventional powers. They ground the explanation, well, because, well, these conventions bring with them a certain kind of standardization, thus supporting generalization and induction. And they also, at least some of them, the type 3 entities notably, bring with them a certain deontic powers, which again, well, explain a certain explanatory appeal of social kinds. Khalidi also answers the mind dependence account. This is kind of tu quoque argument, Well, if we look at entities that are mind dependent, we also find, well, the transuranide elements, which are kind of artifacts humans produce intentionally in a laboratory. Some of these transuranide elements are also patented in the US, for example. Then there are breeds of domestic animals, also, well, of our making, intentionally brought about. Thoughts are, well, what is mind dependent if not thoughts and emotions? And nevertheless, we successfully refer in explanations to thoughts and emotions. So these are all important kinds to which we refer, well, in scientific, in psychological explanations. And that doesn't seem to be a reason why we should treat, well, these transuranic elements in physical explanations differently from the other elements, or why we should, in biology, treat domestic animals differently from other animals. So if reference to explanation works for the non-mind dependent, why shouldn't they work for the mind dependent kinds? So mind dependence seems not to be a hindrance for explanatory relevance in these fields. Why should they be? Should that be a hindrance in the social field? Okay, finally, a word on historicity. Well, social kinds are a subject of historical development, for sure. Social kinds come into being, they cease to be, and they have this contingency connected to them. It was not a law of nature that tells us that there needs to be money. Yeah? We need money for economical reasons, not because there's some natural necessity about that. And yeah, if you look at history in the sense of historiographic disciplines, well, even that came into existence. Well, there was Herodotus, one of the first who wrote histories. Was that already historical science? Well, we can doubt that. It might be that he was a predecessor of, well, modern historiographic science. Theodore Mommsen, for sure, well, he is the paradigmatic historiographic in the 19th century. So he for sure, he was a good paradigm for someone who did historiographic science. And well, we don't know in the future what the future will bring. Maybe historiographic science goes out of fashion and no one does it any longer. There will be maybe successor disciplines which are then, well, historically related, but something different. Well, again, it took quoque argument here because, well, that same feature, of course, is known from biology. In the evolutionary paradigm, we all accept, well, that there are predecessors of humans and that humans, well, came into existence at some point in evolutionary history, and then and now there are humans, and well, we don't know what the future will bring. There are, well, some visions from transhumanist and posthumanist, but even without these visions, we know dinosaurs no longer exist. There only are successor kinds of dinosaurs. So, well, again, Like in the social sphere, the future is open. Now, having sketchily dealt with these objections, I will now turn to the question: how social kinds explain? How can they explain? Well, if we look at the more general question, how can kinds explain? There are two patterns how they can explain, at least. But kinds could depend on certain attributes. Horses are mammals, yes, so that a certain horse is a mammal can be explained by pointing to the fact that horses cannot exist without being mammals. That's constitutive of being a horse. But we can also have the opposite kind of dependence. Attributes can flow as, to use this very nice metaphor from the kind. Horses have 4 legs. That is not, well, really metaphysically constitutive of being a horse. It's causally constitutive. It's not a good life option for horses to have 3 legs only. Well, the horses are herbivores. Also, that's not, well, constitutive of being a horse. But, well, it's consequential. It flows from being a horse. Well, that's what horses do naturally. That is what horses do. And both kinds of explanations can also be found in the social sphere. And so if we ask, how can social kinds explain? Well, just like kinds in general explain. Banks are companies. Yeah, that is constitutive of being a bank. It cannot be a bank without, at the same time, being a company. And on the other hand, we can have attributes flowing from social kinds. Yeah, bank issues credits. Yeah, then that is something banks do. Well, I'm inclined to say naturally, but maybe I shouldn't say that. Yeah, when I go to a certain institution XYZ, and I get a credit from that institution, I may ask, well, why is it that I get a credit here? And I can say, well, that's because we are a bank. Yeah, XYZ is a bank, and that is the explanation why you get a credit issued at XYZ. Now, bank is a type 3 kind. Yeah, that means both the kind and the instances depend for their existence on mental attitudes. Yeah, we need to have attitudes towards the kind bank in order for there to exist the kind bank, and in order for XYZ to be a bank, well, also, well, there needed to be some attitude, at least at the time of establishing XYZ as a bank, as a company and a bank. So banks are intentionally established for certain purposes, and one of these purposes is, well, to issue credits. That kind bank is liable to certain legal regulations, the deontic level, and among other things, these legal regulations regulate issuing credits. So these rules, these conventions are no hindrance to explanation. They support it. The conventions carry deontic powers and dispositions. And these again support my explanation that, well, you get a credit XYZ because XYZ is a bank. Now, there's also important explanatory work for type 1 and type 4 kinds. Well, we have a lot of explanations where uh, social kinds like recession or racism feature prominently. Well, they are not dependent on mental attitudes, but they describe features to which, well, for example, market agents react. And again, well, they are explanatory important. The same goes for the non-intended kinds, like leadership or plural subject. Well, the instances depend on mental attitudes. They depend even on mental attitudes to social kinds. Yeah, for example, well, a leader, to be a leader, and that depends on mental attitudes, maybe on well, mental attitudes towards, well, kings or presidents or whatever, but not necessarily to the social kind leader. And again, we did need to have plural attitudes to the kind plural subject in order to establish plural subjects, if Gilbert is right. So these higher level kinds, which are not in the same way mind dependent, might be helpful to determine the right formal cause, the right level of abstraction. They will be important to pick out the right level of generalization. A lot of social explanations will hinge on their being leaders, but not on their being kings or presidents. Yeah, they are functionally the same when you look at it from the point of view of leadership research. They help to formulate general social explanations that transcend, well, certain cultural or legal systems. There might be a legal system that knows only kings, or a culture that knows no kings but presidents, but still there could be general explanations that apply to both cultures, both legal systems, both epochs. And these general terms will be important for that purpose. And yeah, they will help us to formulate explanations that are robust in the sense that they can be transported to different epochs, to different cultural systems and different legal systems. Okay, so nearing the end, I want to say a bit about social identities. Well, I could say I identify as whatever, yeah? And my identification, self-identification as this whatever could also successfully be referred to in an explanation. Well, why do I do this? Well, because I identify as this and this. Well, why do they do that? Because they identify as such and such. So we also have the use of the flow metaphor here. Yeah, certain behavior traits, certain attitudes, certain properties seem to flow from social identities. So that makes social identities a candidate for social explanations and, well, also for social forms. Yeah, so we have well, explanations with a certain appeal, well, we refer to these social identities as the social explanants. So social identities have a certain explanatory power, and we have this flow of properties. And there's even another benefit, because social identities seem to be much more intrinsic. Well, it's my identification, yeah? It's a mental attitude that is intrinsic to me. While the social kinds that are the contender of being social forms, well, they are very much extrinsic. Yeah, well, there is not even something, yeah, a material bearer to which the status of being a bank could be intrinsic. Banks exist, well, as a network of a lot of extrinsic attitudes, norms, deontic powers, well, related to, well, to whom? To the bank, to the agents of the bank, the shareholders, the employees, the customers. Yeah. So we have a network of, well, extrinsic attitudes that, at the center of which is the bank. So we can refer successfully in social explanations to these legal, economic, social kinds like banks, but they do not share with the good old-fashioned Aristotelian form the intrinsicality that is typical for, well, Aristotelian forms like, well, humanity. Yeah, my humanity is inside of me, intrinsic to me, and yeah, that is what makes the Aristotelian forms, well, these monadic things. Yeah, my form is in me and only in me, as my social identity is in me and only in me. But on the downside, well, at least for some social identities, it is acceptable that you can change your identity. Yeah, you can switch from one identity to the other. And, well, it's a social identity that has to be acquired. So probably no one is born with his or her or they social identities. First, we have to learn a lot. We have to acquire habits. So social identities, while being intrinsic, do not seem to have this rigidity that we connect to forms, to essential forms. So, well, there are two contenders for being social forms, social kinds, and social identities. And if we compare them, they have, the one has some benefits the other does not have. In the end, I suppose we need both of them. So let me come to my penultimate point. Is it dangerous to posit social identities, social kinds as, well, essential forms? If we are very quiet, we can hear our colleagues from the humanities, and they will tell us, well, hey, that's all socially constructed. There are oppressive structures and we want to get rid of them. If you call them essential, we get rid of the leverage to, well, fight oppression. You know these arguments, and of course it's a very honest motivation to point out to the social constructiveness of something, to be able to fight it. But as well as other constructions in the world of human artifacts, also social constructions are not really a hindrance to have essential features. And again, we can point to, well, the rigidity of certain predicates. Yeah, we can build houses and we can destroy houses. And that means we can confer certain essential features to piles of metal, and we can, well, see to it that these essential features are no longer there and the houses cease to exist. And just like houses, social constructions can come into existence and they can cease to exist. And actually, that is necessary if we want to combat them. That is necessary if we want to fight oppression. Then it's better that oppressive structures have essential features that we can remove in order to bring an end to them. Well, it is important to see that, as an upshot, that the necessity that is connected with essential predication is, well, not the necessity of existence. Yeah. If there are essences in the social world, this does not mean that the things that have essential features exist of necessity. It only means that if they exist, then they have these essential features. So we have the necessity of the consequent, not of the consequent. Yeah, we have the necessitas consequentis only. It is a consequence, a conditional that is necessary. Yeah, it's not that the consequent of that the conditional is necessary. So again, we could add a tu quoque argument in biology also, if we want to have biological essences. It's not a necessity that humans exist. At the verge of an atomic war again, we need to be clear about that. It might be that, yeah, just as there was a time when no instance of the kind human existed, there might be a time in the future where no human exists. So better take care. Okay, so I come to the conclusion. So I argued that there can be essential forms in the social domain. I argued that mind dependence, conventionality, and historicity are no hindrance for that. To the contrary, well, conventionality and maybe even mind dependence can support explanations in the social domain. And I discussed two candidates, two contenders for being social forms. Social kinds, as they support classification, rigidity, and explanation, but they are extrinsic. And social identities. They are intrinsic properties that support classification and explanation, but they are not necessarily rigid. So maybe, yeah, we just have to bite the bullet and say, well, yes, there are forms in the social domain, but they are different than in other forms. Yeah, maybe they are not intrinsic or not rigid, or either, or both. Or we say, well, maybe that is not yet the final answer. Maybe we have to combine the two candidates to form a coherent unit to act as a social form. But I do not yet know how to do that. So that would be work for the future. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions.